Alright, hi. Today we're just gonna watch this video and sort of, because I think it has a few good points, but I also think it's missing the mark on some areas, so let's just get into it.
Being widely praised. I specifically remember hearing a lot of buzz about the revealing one's hand mechanic and how clever it was. This binding vow increases the power of a user's ability if they reveal to their enemy how it works, which made sense of the common anime trope of a character explaining how their abilities work by giving the character an incentive to do so. But even back then, I noticed that this technically doesn't answer any questions, and it only really kicks the can down the road. Sure, it answers the question why a character would act that way, but it poses a new question instead. Why does the world work like that in the first place? The burden is passed from a character writing problem to a world building problem, which is exactly where things begin to fall apart for Jujutsu Kaisen. Flash forward to the final arc, and that same mechanic is now one of the most criticized parts of the series. So what exactly happened? Clearly the idea itself wasn't all bad, as it wasn't shot down immediately when it was introduced, but something about the execution clearly missed the mark, especially Sukuna's usage of it. In fact, the idea of it isn't even fully original, because just like a lot of Gege Akutami's writing,
Oh my god, okay. So, I'm using this because I have a really shit memory, unfortunately. And so, let's see, where was it? It was here, right? Okay, here we go. So this
though. But
here.
even back then, I noticed that this technically doesn't answer any questions, and it only really kicks the can down the road. Sure, it answers the question why a character would act that way, but it poses a new question instead. Why does the world work like that in the first place?
So it's not in disagreement entirely, but binding vows are first mentioned in this chapter, I believe. Let's see. Keep going, keep going. No, not this. Here, two conditions. Here we go. There comes. Does this really answer the question? Okay, I don't think this really does anything. I'm just gonna be right back. Okay, so I'm just gonna come back to that later if I can, but
Clearly the idea itself wasn't all bad, as it wasn't shot down immediately when it was introduced, but something about the execution clearly missed the mark, especially Sukuna's usage of it.
I think the thing here is that let's look at this from a broader perspective, because this is Sukuna we're talking about here. And considering that he was able to defeat Dojo, then it brings up the large question of how are we going to defeat Sukuna now? Oh my fucking god, this thing won't close. That's annoying. So look, right? And then Hashimo, the next dude, we already know how he went out. So yeah, we know that Kashimo was also killed pretty quickly after that. And so obviously, once those two are gone, because Sukuna is just doing strongest sorcerer shit, people are just mad because he's literally the strongest sorcerer, and these characters can't do anything about it. This is the start of the Shinjuku Showdown, or not the start, but the continuation. And so yeah, as we know, Sukuna is able to pretty easily navigate all these hurdles, which, oh my god, that's gonna be really annoying. Yeah, here, okay. Because, like, look, you can just do this at any point of the series, and no one can do shit about it. And so, like, when Sukuna is using the system to his advantage to get an advantage, people are mad because, well, it makes it harder to believe that Sukuna will actually lose, which is a totally fair reason to, you know. Anyways, next point.
Hunter. Yet Nen condition seems to be much better received, despite being the exact same mechanic. So why? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to be answering in this video, and I think it comes down to two problems specifically. First is the arbitration problem, who decides what's equal? And second is the time preference problem, what is the cost of making the vows in of itself?
So I think the first thing to point out is that Nen conditions and binding vows are not, they are not functionally the same. They have a lot of similarities, but they are not the same. Because I don't remember if this is ever stated, but I'm fairly certain that you can't really reverse a Nen condition. Hunter. I will post. Oh, okay. Let's see. Where was it? Not this one. Here we go. Back one chapter. And as you can see, there is like a very explicit statement about what happens if you break a condition with that you make with yourself in Jujutsu Kaisen, but to my knowledge, this doesn't apply in Hunter x Hunter. Although the conditions that I do remember, I did have to ask. Let's see, condition. Holy shit. And then the limitation. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Okay. This is not a known condition, is it? Okay, I think this is irrelevant. Okay, so my Hunter x Hunter knowledge is a bit fuzzy because I haven't been into it for a while. But to my knowledge, that you can't really undo a Nen condition like you can undo a self-imposed binding vow. And also, there is the fact that binding vows have a have a second party function as well, which is entirely different, and I'm fairly certain that the same isn't in Hunter x Hunter, where it's completely mutual and very much depends on the mutual agreement of both parties. Because Kurapika's judgment chain is, well, let's see. Let's see. Here, see? So in the case of Kurapika's, you know, forced conditions on someone else, it's something that they have to follow or they will die. Jujutsu Kaisen, the punishment isn't really made clear at all. It really isn't made at all, in fact. Or, well, we don't really know what happens, but yeah.
Now I'll be explaining how Hunter x Hunter fixes that first problem, but also how Jujutsu Kaisen could have fixed the second problem with one simple change. The idea of equivalent exchange in anime is most associated with alchemy in Full Metal Alchemist, but it appears in other series as well. The idea is that one can achieve power or something of value by sacrificing something else of equal value. This is the basic idea that both binding vows and Nen conditions are based on, but it begs the question of who exactly decides what counts as equal. In my eyes, there are two possibilities when it comes to how equivalent exchange is decided. The first option is that equal is decided by the user themselves, and the second
Yes.
option is that there's a higher third party which arbitrates on their behalf.
This isn't really true. I mean, I would say, like, a binding vow would be like making a promise to yourself, right? Because, you know, this is the worst that can happen. It's like, let's say you want to say that you can only do squats on Tuesdays, right? And so, in exchange for doing those squats on Tuesdays, you get to do more reps. And if you don't want to do more reps on Tuesdays anymore, you can just not do more reps on Tuesdays, and you don't really lose anything. So this, basically what I'm getting at is that you are the one who decides what's equal. And of course, there is a logical element to it as well, because, you know, you can't just decide, oh, I'm going to become God just to kill Sukuna, which, you know, like, you obviously cannot think of any way to equate that to something as small as I can't use my left pinky anymore, because you know it's not reasonable. It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, you are the one who decides what's equal, and in a mutual binding vow, it's both parties get to decide on specific conditions, and that's what sets those two apart, I think. Let's see if it's mentioned here. Hmm. Here, one of the differences. Okay. Hmm. Well, that's unfortunate. Maybe Sukuna discusses it. Chapter 11, I think. Yes. Mutual interests. So obviously, it's both sides have to be very explicit about their conditions. Or, well, not really explicit, but they have to have an idea of what they want. And so, that explains the whole 200 chapter 213 thing, which just manga spoilers, of course. Which, yeah, this is not. This is 213. Scrolling slow. Oh shit. Hold on, no. It's 212. Okay. Right? So basically, within the binding vow, you can sort of figure out loopholes. Interesting. So, there's that. Let's continue.
Jujutsu Kaisen seems to have a combination of both. There are self-imposed limitations, like the revealing one's hand vow that I brought up earlier, but there's also binding vows that can be created between two or more individuals.
Yes.
These vows are heavily respected by sorcerers, as the punishment for breaking them is unknown but is presumed to be severe. But the fact that there is a default punishment that is applied if the two parties did not agree on one beforehand implies that there is some higher third-party arbitrator in Jujutsu Kaisen that manages binding vows. The best evidence of this is heavenly restrictions, which are binding vows placed on a user at birth, which obviously means that the newborn isn't the one who said it. The heavenly part is not supposed to mean that the bearer is necessarily more blessed than others, it's supposed to mean that the restriction was applied from a higher power, but the abilities granted themselves are meant to be an equal trade-off. But I wouldn't be surprised if some readers got the wrong impression and thought that Maki and Toji were blessed by God and Mekamaru was cursed by the devil, because in practice, their heavenly restrictions don't seem to be equal at all. Mekamaru's heavenly restriction gave him immense curse energy output and range, in exchange for being born with paper skin and glass bones. But I think most fans would agree with me that there's almost no amount of curse energy that is worth being completely paralyzed and stuck in physical agony in a dungeon for all of your days. Mekamaru is lucky to even be born with puppet manipulation, which is one of the only curse techniques that can make his restriction tolerable, but perhaps that was taken into account as well when balancing out his restriction. Toji and Maki's heavenly restriction is the exact opposite of Mekamaru's, making them extremely physically powerful in exchange for having zero curse energy. Maki's power is said to be equal to Toji when fully realized, which at first made me think that the equivalent exchange sacrificed the potential of curse energy in general rather than the specific amount that they would have had. But it's been stated that only those who would have inherited powerful curse techniques or curse energy could unlock a heavenly restriction. So I'm not exactly sure why their heavenly restrictions are equal, unless the curse energy and techniques that they would have had would have been the exact same strength overall anyways. Occam's razor just says that they got the exact same deal, but my point is that it's a much better deal than Mekamaru's restriction. Equivalent exchange mechanics in fiction will never be perfect, because they're not actually arbitrated by an omnipotent god, but by a real-life author who is very omnipotent. But this begs the question, in universe, just how omnipotent is this arbitrator? The heavenly part of heavenly restriction implies that it comes from a higher power, which could just be curse energy itself, or perhaps even a sentient being. We know curse energy can create vengeful curses and curse spirits, so it isn't out of the question for it to create a spirit of curse energy that manages binding vows, or perhaps there's even a god that created curse energy itself. But the vow that Hikari makes in his fight against Kashimo suggests that this arbitrator may not be sentient, or at least isn't very Faustian when it comes to its bargains. In his fight against Kashimo, Hikari makes a vow that sacrifices his arm in exchange for saving his body.
Okay, here's where it is, the problem. The case with the self-imposed binding vow is very, very different from a binding vow made with another person. Because, well, actually, I'm not going to get into that because I'm completely headband, but basically, he just sacrifices, he just decides that he doesn't want to. Okay, I don't know how to word this, actually, but what my point is that he just forces his body to push curse energy into everywhere but the arm that he lost. And so that's obviously pretty easily reversible, because if you just have that arm back, then you can just, right? Because what he did was he wanted to endure a lightning strike, or was it a lightning strike? Okay, right here. He gets blown up in a steam explosion and decides to designate the rest of his body with the cursed energy that would have gone into his arm to make it stronger, or to reinforce himself enough. So yeah.
The vow technically just reallocated his arm's cursed energy throughout his body, but the effect is the same. He loses a limb instead of dying, which is a net positive. This suggests that binding vows don't necessarily care whether or not the consequences are equal, as long as what's sacrificed is. But there's another case in the story that shows the exact opposite, where a sorcerer makes an extreme sacrifice that amounts to nothing, and that's the binding vow that Miwa makes against Kenjaku. Miwa sacrifices her ability to use a sword in the future to empower a single strike, yet it's completely ineffective against Kenjaku, who is.
Yes, that's correct. And because like the thing is, all of Miwa's power, if I remember correctly, it should be 173. Rough estimate. $35 maybe? Or no, that's too far. Here we go. I'm putting everything, my present and future, into this, even if it means I can never swing a katana again. So, I think you could also make the argument that this isn't an actual binding vow because she says, even if it means. Present and future
Isn't
is
even that
pretty
much
vague, so I couldn't really
of a
tell you
physical
what it
powerhouse in the
means.
grand scheme of things. But if we're following the logic of Hakari's vow, this should have worked. The combined power of all Miwa's sword swings in the future should be devastating, no matter how weak they are individually.
No, not really. Because Mila has never been stated to have any remarkable potential, if any at all, actually. She's a third year in Jujutsu High, and she has barely even grown. So, even if you want to compound it and say, like, oh, she had like another 50 years, that still really doesn't do anything because her rate of growth is just far too slow. And unlike, let's say, Yuji, for example, he had the help of Sukuna, actually, and also Yuta's sorcery, I guess. So he had a lot more that he could grow into as a sorcerer compared to Miwa, who's literally just a person with cursed energy and a sword. That's it. And she definitely doesn't really train, and I'm fairly certain you can tell, or, well, you can infer that based on the fact that she literally calls herself, well, maybe she does train, but it's just not very effective because she calls herself useless. And that's not really something you would say if you're like, if you had even slightly high potential. So that's just not right, I guess.
Akutami must have realized how ridiculous it would be to allow any sorcerer to take out the main villains if they were just sacrificial enough. Or perhaps it could just be that as a female side character in the shonen manga, Miwa's future wasn't really worth anything in the first place.
This is just grasping at straws. Like, it literally does not mean anything whatsoever. Because Arata fucking Nita exists. He does nothing. Well, he does one thing. He just prevents Novara from dying, and he stops Yuji from taking any severe injury, which it doesn't even do anything because he just takes more injuries afterwards. So, like, this is such a non-point. Jeez, bro.
When it comes to Hakari's vow, it seems to only matter if the inputs of what's sacrificed is equal. But for Miwa's vow, it's the exact opposite. It seems like it's judging what's equal based on the consequences, which is why it doesn't work. This is what I meant when I said the binding vow system only kicks the can down the road, because now the world has to be consistent in how it applies the equivalent exchange.
Yes, well, equivalent exchange is a pretty huge thing. Because, like, in what world would Miwa ever be equal to even, like, Suguru Geto as a sorcerer? Like, try to picture that. You just can't, right? And so I think if Miwa decided to sacrifice her entire life and put all of that into one strike, like how Bird Strike works, for example, that would be significantly more effective than I will never swing a sword. Or actually, no, I will probably never swing a sword. Like, it's not even a certain vow, which is certainly something to think about, but whatever. Not here. Not this one. It's not this one. Wow, okay. Maybe it's after Dagon? No, well, I'll just be right back and look for it. Okay, I found the chapter. Let's see. There we go. See? A binding vow with your life as the trade-off. So, even if Miwa has dog-shit cursed energy, if she put her life into it, then she would be able to do this. Possibly, actually. Although I would very highly bet on it, because let's see. Oh, right. It's chapter 243, I believe. After all this. 244. Or maybe, no, it's before that. 239, perhaps. Oh, here we go. See? Gojo, Kenjaku, and Sukuna. They all avoid it or shoot it down. Or in Gojo's case, he just has infinity, which, that's a pretty obvious thing. But yeah, this is just false equivalence, and it's just when you go back to chapter 80, I think my memory is just horrible. 79, I think. Yes. When you go back to this, right? Oh my god. So when you go back to this, then the most that she's really losing is just not swinging the sword and I guess not using cursed energy, which, that's so minuscule because you can just use other weapons. Like, you can have other cursed tools as well. So, yeah.
If the exchange is arbitrated by the world itself, then it should be objective and the same for everyone, unless that arbitrator is actually sentient and biased towards certain characters. This would feel like a Deus Ex Machina if there really is a god secretly favoring a certain character, and it would be just as bad even if there isn't, because at the end of the day, the real god that decides what is fair is the author, which would just feel like plot armor instead, which is the
There's also a certain level of skill that goes into creating a binding vow, which is
feeling we get about Sukuna's character near the end
which is what makes or breaks the difference between like even just Hakari, for example, compared to Miwa of all fucking people, which this isn't shade to Miwa or anything, but she's not particularly talented, or nor does she have any even just good potential. Like not even good potential, like maybe average potential at best. So I really don't see what the point is here.
Of the series because these mechanics really aren't set up that well. Hunter x Hunter, on the other hand, doesn't really have this gray area where a character can exploit the equivalent exchange system because of the subjective nature of the arbitration. Nen vows are also known as self-imposed limitations, meaning it's up to each individual Nen user to come up with their own limitations and penalties. There isn't any universal system for Nen users to make Nen enforce agreements with each other like there is with binding vows, so to do so, one would need to create their own ability. And that's exactly what Kurapika does with his Judgment Chain, which forces anyone he plunges his Nen dagger into to obey his commands. Judgment Chain isn't a sentient or objective arbitrator, rather, it seems to activate based on whether the target's conscience thinks they violated the set rule. This fits symbolically too, since it's attached to the target's heart, and explains why Kurapika has to clearly explain the condition to the target for
Just nitpicking here, but that's specifically with Kurapika, I believe, because he set a condition on himself with Judgment Chain that he would not use Chain Gel on any other Phantom Troop or any person who isn't from the Phantom Troop. But whatever.
it to work. This also explains why when Chrollo feels comfortable talking to Hisoka, he's able to. But when Pakunoda feels like using her ability on the troop violates the rule, it kills her instantly. Initially, Kurapika wanted to make a vow where he can only use his abilities against the Phantom Troop in exchange.
Well, no, the thing is, with that, it's blatantly clear that Hisoka just isn't a member of the Phantom Troop, because Pakunoda literally talks to him after the contract, if I remember correctly. Wow. See? Like, she's interacting with him right here. So that's
Exchange for his life if he breaks it, which would increase his power as a result. But because he would need to use his
that wasn't meant to be a debunk or anything, just a small nitpick.
Judgment Chain ability to do so, he couldn't be sure if that in of itself would count as violating his own rule. Now, we've seen other Nen users create conditions to their abilities without needing to create another ability to facilitate it, so perhaps Judgment Chain was only needed to apply the death penalty specifically instead of the default penalty. So perhaps that suggests that there's a universal arbitrator that judges how severe that limitation is and dishes out the appropriate amount of Nen in exchange. But an even simpler solution is that the strength of the condition is based on the strength of the resolve of the character, because as we know, emotions and other factors play into aura strength as well. So it seems like a character in Hunter x Hunter can't really cheat the system because it's based on their own conscience and resolve, unless they just happen to be a delusional egomaniac, which might explain Hisoka's situation in his fight against Chrollo. This doesn't seem to be the case in Jujutsu Kaisen, as Mahito has to be reminded that the consequences for breaking a vow will be much more severe than he thinks, and that he shouldn't be so sure of himself. So
I don't really know what the point is here either. Because Mahito is like 4 months old at most. So he doesn't really know how binding vows work, period. And actually, a lot of sorcerers don't. They just, well, actually, I guess they would have to. I don't know. I'm just yapping. I'm sorry.
while the objective arbitration of binding vows can cause plot holes and contrivances if the equivalent exchange is not always equal, Nen vows doesn't really have this problem for the most part. The equivalent exchange is arbitrated by the users themselves, so it makes sense that the exchange isn't always equivalent because it's
I feel like if you're gonna say that there is a plot hole, you would also need to at least point to a plot hole. Like, a plot hole is basically when a plot point contradicts another. A retcon is when they rewrite the past with said plot point, or in the future. That's all semantics. I'm just yapping here.
depend on the subjective judgment of each individual. But regardless of that, if the arbitration process is subjective or objective, or even if the trade-offs are fair or not, the fact that a character can even make a binding vow is a huge advantage in of itself. While binding vows inherently have a cost, there doesn't seem to be any cost for making a vow in of itself, and we see all levels of sorcerers doing so. But getting to choose when to enjoy the benefits and pay the cost of an exchange matters just as much as the benefits themselves, and that's due to the idea of time preferences. In economics, time preferences is the idea that having something in the present moment is more valuable than having it in the future. If I ask you if you wanted to
I'm not really sure what he's getting at with this one whatsoever. Because, like, if you're giving up one thing to get another thing in specific, then what does compound interest have to do with any of it? What does like a stockpiling it have any relationship to punching harder, I guess? I don't know. Okay, here you go. Let's see. Take nominees.
Investing and borrowing. Take Nanami's overtime vow, for example, which limits his curse energy to only around 80 to 90% during working hours, but after that he's able to use 110 to 120% of his maximum power. Based on the percentages, it seems like Nanami is given back the exact same amount of curse energy that he sacrificed, so it's treated like he's saving rather than investing. But I think Nanami should have been given some extra curse energy for making this deal, not only because overtime typically pays more, but also locking away his curse energy during his prime hours is a huge risk, and he should be.
This kind of defeats the whole point of equal pay for equal reward, you know? Because if you're gonna say like, I'm gonna put 5 energy into this for like 6 p.m., then you know, getting 6 energy back in return when it's 6 p.m., it just doesn't make much sense, and it's not really equal give or take in that sense.
Compensated for that. This is the same reason why putting your money in a high yield savings account or retirement account pays higher returns, as the banks and investors pay extra for that time preference, which is why there are penalties and limitations for withdrawing early. A perfect example of a character who just saved curse energy rather than investing is Mekamaru, who stored up to 17 years of curse energy while he was paralyzed and used it in his fight against Mahito. So perhaps he could have won that fight if he made a binding vow like Nanami to give up that curse energy and allow it to compound over time. Obviously, Mekamaru doesn't do this because it's not part of the power system, but if it was, it would make perfect sense for someone like Nanami to make it a part of his moveset, as he literally worked in finance before he became a sorcerer. This isn't really a problem with any of the characters, this is just the author not understanding the importance of, or at least not incorporating, time preferences into the story.
And he's going to go into Hakawara here, which is basically just a literal bank. Verbatim. No. Can you say verbatim? No, you can't really. It's literally just a bank, but for aura. Which isn't really a fair comparison when it's like, let's say you want to put $5 into a safe, right? $5 of cash into a safe. That $5 is not going to turn into $6 magically if you don't count for inflation and, you know. That's just yap. Completely unrelated. So it's basically like putting $5 of cash into a safe rather than $5 into a savings account, which is made for the purpose of gaining interest and saving up your money. Because the binding vow has never really been there's no commentary on. I'm just making up words here. There's nothing that points to like saving first energy would mean that it can just compound and grow a bunch to, you know, be used later at a much higher degree than what you put into it. So yeah, that part just, I don't get it. We can just skip Knuckle the whole thing. Okay, here we go. This.
Vows like Gon's vow against Pito, where he used up all the power he ever would have had in the future in a single moment in exchange for his life. Gon essentially reached the ceiling of power in the Hunter x Hunter world, rivaling even Meruem for a moment, but we have been told time and time again that he and Killua have almost unrivaled potential and could have likely become some of the top Nen users of all time. So Gon pays a heavy price, not only dying, but his Nen was so malicious that it could have even done more damage post-mortem. Now all of that was undone, but that was because of Nanika's ability, which is all about being able to grant any wish, but passing the burden onto the next person. And there's even a bit of compound interest there, as the next person inherits an even heftier tab than the previous, which could result in the deaths of millions if not paid off. Honestly though, I think the real reason why fans are more apologetic towards Gon's vow is not because it's super balanced and fair, but because of the great character writing that led up to it. But looking at things objectively, I think it is kind of an ass pull, and Gon got some extra grace as the main character. The same way.
How is this an ass pull? Because, man, because look, like, where is it explained? Right here. The stricter the limitation, the more power your ability will gain. So
Way Miwa got shafted because she's a side character.
Miwa did not put her life into this. She just said, I will not swing a katana again. And you could probably interpret this as I will not use cursed energy ever again, but that's also bullshit because she just does. So it's clearly more in reference to swinging a katana. So she just loses her ability to swing a katana. That's pretty much it. But Gon, on the other hand, is losing his entire fucking life. So what is this comparison? Like, actually. And this isn't hate. You can this guy probably makes some pretty good videos, but this one I see what he's going for, but it's just wrong in some areas. So yeah.
Because even if Gon really did only access all the power he would have had, and paid an even bigger fee for doing so, it's still unrealistic. Because in real life, if you went to a bank and asked for a loan of all the money you would ever make, even if you had a great and stable career, you would still be rejected. Because there's another ingredient that you need to take out loans aside from your interest, which is credit.
This is where you cannot apply real life logic into fiction because, well, conditions aren't really like putting money into a bank account whatsoever. So I don't know. I think he's doing it in a more specific way that I'm not understanding here, but yeah. Okay, here we go. I think this should be it.
System had the potential to fix this problem because there's an objective arbitrator that exists. The biggest offender when it comes to binding vows and soured the concept the most is Ryomen Sukuna. Sukuna has made by far the most binding vows in the series, which isn't a problem in of itself, but the problem is that he seemingly creates binding vows on the spot that are perfectly tailored for his situation. The worst example is his world-cutting slash vow, where Sukuna gains the ability to instantly use it against Gojo in exchange for adding more conditions.
Yes, because binding vows are a very, very big part of sorcery, and Sukuna can do it basically seemingly on a whim because of his knowledge of jujutsu that some people just he just knows a lot about jujutsu. That's the big idea.
On the back end in future uses. Just like with Akari's vow, the inputs are the thing that are being equally exchanged rather than the consequences, as he definitely would have died if he hadn't fought Gojo off guard. But even if you think Sukuna paid an equivalent price afterwards plus interest, it still isn't enough because he did it instantly and silently. Just like I said, the ability to make a binding vow is powerful in of itself, and the fact that Sukuna takes advantage of it more than anyone else feels like plot armor. But I think the solution
You could also apply this to Hunter x Hunter. Why don't more people use then conditions?
to this is if binding vows were developed into a skill in of itself, and there's a simple and effective mechanic that could have bridged this gap, which came to the forefront in this final battle as well, which is incantations. My fix is making it so that sorcerers need to chant an incantation in order to make a binding vow, instead of just thinking it in their head.
This is a nonsensical fix. I think it defeats the main aspect of sorcery, which is deception. You win by deception. You don't win by being fair. You lie your ass off until you win. It also really helps that TCB has arc names for. So now, let's see. Here we go. I don't know if I like this wording here. So let's see what John Weary, the fucking terrorist of Jujutsu Kaisen, has to say. 72. That's my goat Ryu up there. A sorcerer is nothing but a con artist. Yes, I think that makes a lot more sense then. I guess it all comes down to the sorcerer's lies, but yeah. So basically, it defeats the whole point of being a con artist if you have to explain every fucking thing that you did. Because I'm fairly certain this doesn't even apply in Hunter x Hunter. You have to be very. It's all based on your willpower. It's not based on what you say, right? So why would it? The same thing happens with Jujutsu Kaisen. It's not really based on what you say. It's about what you think and what you're resolving to do with a specific thing. So it doesn't really add anything to say what your vow is, and it also just, I think it just ruins a whole lot of things. Like, I think it's just cope, like straight up. Like, oh, Sukuna should have said, I can't do this, and then I'll slash you with this one specific infinity bypassing dismantle. And that's basically what this point is here.
We learned in Gojo and Sukuna's fight that many curse techniques come with incantations that if chanted would increase the potency of that technique. But we were actually introduced to incantations much earlier in the series when it came to curtains, which are just a type of barrier. Barriers are made from pure cursed energy, which is why it's typically the sorcerers without innate techniques who specialize in casting them. The conditions for curtains can be changed and adjusted as well, following the same principle of equivalent exchange. And this is most likely done through binding vows themselves, as we see with Sukuna in his domain clash with Gojo. So it's possible that the default curtain chant is just a binding vow that is needed to make a barrier into a curtain, which has specific pros and cons. If that's the case, then it would make perfect sense if a different incantation results in a different barrier that is not necessarily stronger, but has different conditions. And I think this logic should be applied to every binding vow. Each one should have its own incantation that is needed to perform it. When it comes to binding vows, more concrete language would be needed to be incanted to specify the conditions of the vow, as opposed to the chants for curse techniques, which use very abstract and poetic word choice to amplify the techniques. Binding vows would then become a skill, requiring someone to incant a phrase that will balance the concrete and technical conditions, while being poetic and abstract enough to strengthen their technique. And if that were the case, it would make perfect sense for Sukuna to be the best at it, as he's an ancient sorcerer with tons of experience, and talks in a very poetic way. On top of that, having an extra set of arms and an extra mouth to incant his binding vows would explain why he can do it mid-fight, unlike the rest of the sorcerers. So by making binding vows a skill that needs to be practiced and improved, it fixes this credit problem, which is the final flaw when it comes to binding vows.
Okay, so the issue is with the fact that it's all about banking with this, which I don't see a problem with, but okay, well actually I do, because otherwise I wouldn't be making this video. Let's see here. Okay, right here. Previous chapter. Okay. Down here. Right here. It would kind of ruin the moment if Yuji said, oh, my dismantle will become stronger if I tap your soul, or the barrier between your soul. And so, it defeats the whole deceit aspect, or the deception aspect, because Sukuna could just try to hop away, I guess. Because I don't think he's too weak that he can't just run away from Yuji at this point, which is probably absurd to say, but that's just my thoughts on it, right? You can also correct me if you think I'm wrong about that, but yeah. And then let's see. Right.
Now, if incantations were necessary for binding vows, then it would make it impossible for Gojo to be caught off guard with the world-cutting slash, because he would have
See, this is just cope. Like, I'm sorry, this is cope.
seen and heard it coming. But honestly, that's a good thing, because a power system's limits only really matter if they restrict the storytelling possibilities. And in this
Yeah, but that would also very heavily restrict the storytelling ability, because the mystery, a huge part of what makes a story interesting is its mystery, because, like, look here, right? Jeez. Don't you think it's a lot more interesting to have it be explained? Okay, well, that's not how to word this. Holding your hand in every single attack just ruins the immersion of the fight, right? Because look, Gojo was beating this dude's ass. Well, actually not. He was not, but he was able to hold his own, and he was able to fight back against Sukuna, Makara, and Agito. And so, imagine here, right? Right here. It breaks the immersion for Gojo to be talking about his winning move, and then Sukuna just like, I'm gonna sacrifice my ability to use Dismantle, or I'm gonna sacrifice my ability to target space instantly by having to use hand signs and a chant, because it ruins the hype that you feel in this moment. It ruins the immersion. Your it ruins the disbelief that you feel in the next chapter, which is incredible. It's more incredible storytelling than explaining what the move is before it happens. In this case, anyways.
In this case, that would be for the better. I don't think anyone was satisfied with how Sukuna beat Gojo anyways, and I think if anything, he should have died because he was being selfless, and not because he was being careless. But going into
What? He's not being careless about any of this. Alright, this is a whole other video topic, so I think I should just cut this short. Join my Discord, subscribe, like this video, and share it with others because I don't know, I just want to get big, really. But I want to do my own thing as well because I want to make videos that people want to watch, but I'm also doing this for myself. It's not for any grand purpose, it's just because I like doing it. And, you know, yeah. Alright, bye.